Hello and welcome. This is a lecture on Southern society and slavery in the years prior to the Civil War, the antebellum years. And we're just going to start off by talking, what is the nature of slavery? Because there's a lot of sort of mythology about it, and a lot of ignorance about it as well. And some of the ignorance or myths is that slaves were kind of happy under this system. This still persists to this day. And there's also, that it was just so violent. What it was a lot of complex human relationships. Every slave, every master had a different relationship and thoughts about the other, and so it's very difficult to easily define what slavery was because it was so many different things to different people. Okay, what's it all about? The slaves, of course, is cotton. Cotton was king, as they called it, and there was good money to be had in cotton. And this is showing a cotton warehouse, I believe, in New Orleans here. And here is the plantation cotton fields where cotton is being grown. So the cycle that it went is, you invest money in land and slaves, and then you can earn more money from that. And what do you use the money for? Or you purchase more land and slaves, and again you reap the reward. And wealth tended to get concentrated, very much so. Cotton was the leading export of the nation. More than half of all exports from the United States by 1840, 1850 were cotton. And the money that was being brought into the country definitely helped to be used to invest in the Industrial Revolution in the United States, that being invested more up in the North. The North benefited a lot from this whole thing. This is not something confined to the South. A lot of the initial capital investment and that coming right back to the banks, and New England textile industry, they purchased a lot of the cotton themselves, and shipping, a lot of the shipping was done on northern ships. And England as well is sort of economically tied to the South. 75% of their cotton imports coming from the South, and this gave Southern leaders sort of this attitude that in the event of a civil war over slavery, that Britain would come onto their side. And when we get to the Civil War, Britain and France, Britain more so, will play a crucial role in the fate of the South. Okay, so we see the change in the map from 1820 to 1860, and we can see here major areas of production. And by 1820, it was still sort of the old South in the Carolinas and Virginia, not so much in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, along the Mississippi River. But by 1860, we can see we have a lot more. And this area right here, Georgia into Alabama and Mississippi, and up the Mississippi River there, that is known as sort of like the Black Belt or the Cotton Belt. A large swath of land devoted to this. Now, in the northern South, like up in Kentucky and Tennessee, Missouri, these areas up there, because of climate, there's a lot less cotton production going on there, and they're starting to be a little bit more oriented towards the north, and their production is more for food crops and not sort of the need for the labor that the southern South had. And we can see this area here. This is the southern mountain regions where the hillbillies will be sort of in that area there. And here we're showing the total percentage of the population that is slaves. And you can see in 1820, much more. This is the old South, Virginia and the Carolinas. That's where we see large percentages. And And we can see here by the 1860s, a large percent of the population is African American. All right, now who owns slaves? This pie chart is showing the number of people who owned how many slaves. So this green here, those are the number of people who owned 100 or more slaves, and you can't even see them on here. They're in between this blue and red right here. So it's a very small percentage of the population who owned a lot of slaves. Now the ones who are 50 to 99 slaves, that's represented by this little sliver there. 20 to 49 slaves, that's this one here. 10 to 19 slaves, 5 to 9 slaves, just 2 or 4 slaves owning 1 slave. And we can see the largest group, 75% of the population in the South owned 0 slaves at all. So it's a very sort of unequal society. Now this group here, the major slave owners, we're going to call them the slaveocracy. They're powerful, strong political influence, vested interest in maintaining the status quo, of not changing this economic system, and the most to lose from an end to the system. And the arguments that will be coming out in defense of slavery that we'll be getting to, these arguments were coming from these people. And another representation, this one's right from your textbook. Now this aristocratic slave-owning planter group, what kind of people were they? Well, they're very sort of haughty, arrogant people. And this is the big house where they live, planter house, and a very small percentage of the population, but a very disproportionate number of government representatives. John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, they're part of this group here, and they would own, very wealthy. They've got leisure time for study, reflection, and their kids could go off to school off to England or northern schools. They also felt, it was their duty to serve the public as if they're the best, and they're very much living in a fantasy world. They're idealizing, they're romanticizing their world as this feudal society, and with them sort of as the nobles of this society. Now, they're slaves of their own system. The environment, growing of cotton, it depletes the soil of nutrients, and so you've got some good years, but then it'll start to just dry up the soil, and you're going to have to move west and open up new land. So it's naturally expansionistic economic system. It concentrated wealth, and it's a very unstable economic system. Your capital is in your slaves, and that capital could very easily be wiped out through death or accident or running away. You've got heavy speculation in both land and slaves, and so there's a lot of over capital being put into the system, and speculation is never really good in any kind of economic system. If the price of cotton was to go down, your entire economy will go down. You see that in countries today that rely too heavily on the export of one product, say oil. When that price comes down, all of a sudden, and you've got no control over it, your entire economic system is going to come down as well. And there's little motivation to invest in any other industry, and it's a system that's not going to attract immigrants. Why would a German want to compete with his labor up against the slave labor? Now, the big group who own no slaves at all, and they're often stereotyped, and this is the stereotype of the hillbilly with his moonshine and his pipe and his beard and raggedy pants, and there's one right there. This group, they tend to be isolated away from much of society. They're not participating in the market economy simply through a lack of infrastructure of where they are. They cannot produce except for the local market, so they're just generally still producing for themselves. They're people living, in the pre-market revolution time. A lot of pig and corn is the main crops, and very much isolated except for occasional, big marriage or maybe a religious revival camp. But for the most part, though, they're isolated. There's the stereotypes, and they definitely suffered from malnutrition, parasites. no public schools or anything like that. They tend to be ignorant, which is not stupid. They're not necessarily stupid people, but they lack knowledge, this group. Now, they are also vehemently like this most racist group and passionate supporters of slavery. Now, why? Well, their dream is maybe one day I can own a slave too, and you can move up. And because of the existence of slaves, their own status, they're up a step. If slaves were to all of a sudden become freed, then they might even find themselves lower than freed blacks in the social hierarchy. And so they're very strongly opposed to the idea of freeing slaves. Now, in terms of the slave trade, it had been banned in 1808, but smuggling will occur, and but there's going to be a very strong internal slave trade as well. Now, a lot of capital invested in the slaves. Why risk your slave for dangerous work? They would often hire Irish to do that kind of work. And slavery in the United States is very different from South America and the Caribbean, where there's still a lot of importing, because slaves would suffer from disease much more often in these regions. Whereas slavery in the United States is outside of the tropical regions, and so slaves are more likely to live and to live into reproductive periods. And so there's going to be the production of new slaves as slaves are giving birth to their children. And you get much different concept of race in the United States system of slavery, and much more racist system of slavery as captured slave in Africa. Now, for females, sexual abuse was quite common, and female slaves could use that sometimes to obtain certain privileges. And she's living in her world. She's got to do what she needs to do to survive. They are often abused by jealous wives as well. And if you were a good breeder, you'd have higher status. Maybe some of the most valuable slaves would be a female slave just entering into her reproductive years, say 15, 16 years old, because of the ability of that slave to produce more slaves. Slaves are quite valuable in today's dollars, in the tens of thousands for certain slaves, depending on your age and your physical characteristics, different values. Slave auctions is how they were sold, and here is one here. Slave auctions were very emotional for the slaves. It's at these that you might find yourself separated from your mother or your father, or a husband and wife to be separated as well. Now, as we said, every slave will have a different experience, and the only way that you can get this economic system to work is through the use of violence. And we've got two groups of people. Breakers are the ones who will break a resistant slave, and drivers is the one in the field, encouraging the work to move forward. And a lot of resilience on the part of slaves. Their main goal was to maintain the family as a unit. Not all was possible. But it happened, they were able to maintain this a little bit more often than is thought. And they found hope in Christianity. Christianity and its message of salvation really resonated strongly with those Africans who were exposed to the message. And in particular also the story of Exodus, the second book of the Old Testament, which is the story of Moses leading slaves out of Egypt to their freedom, crossing the Red Sea. And this was, the metaphor of the Red Sea is the Ohio River. You got to cross that sea to get to your freedom. This is a device used to, it's got bells there to keep track of slaves who might be trying to hide. and she's wearing one there. Many slaves were in the homes and very often were the ones taking care of the babies, often as wet nurses, providers of milk for young babies. It's a very strange relationship. And resistance. The slaves, of course, resisted and resisted all the time. And, you can accidentally break equipment, so you can see it, but I'm doing some air quotes there, accidentally. You try to slow down the work, and you can fake injury, fake illness, stealing from the big house, running away, and by open revolt, which was pretty rare. And if we look at why they were quite rare, well, it was very hard to organize, and you've got to make choices. Do you go with this revolt that you're hearing whispers of, or do you maybe try to use it to gain something by ratting them out? And very difficult to organize as well because of the lack of literacy, a lack of communication. Slaves were often isolated from other slaves. You're on a plantation. You're not mixing and meeting and communicating with slaves on other plantations. So how to plan? Nat Turner, which was very much of a turning point because of how violent it was, and this was in 1832. This led to a very strong clamping down on slaves, much stricter slave codes, and a really vociferous attack on abolitionists, those who were advocating the freeing of slaves, especially William Lloyd Garrison. And they're going to shut off any debate of slavery at this point. Amistad was a slave ship came ashore off of Long Island, New York, and there was a question of whether or not they were, American slaves, like from the United States, in which case they need to go back into slavery, or were they actually from Africa and therefore could not be imported into the country and should be free. And John Quincy Adams successfully was able to prove this before the Supreme Court. There's a great movie on Amistad called Amistad, directed by Steven Spielberg. If you haven't seen it, I recommend checking that out. Alright, that's where we're going to stop. Next lecture, we'll look at those abolitionists themselves. Thank you very much.